At 2:47 a.m., a lone silhouette slipped through the west wing entrance, captured on a grainy security frame, but absent from every badge log. By morning, George H. Bush noticed a small disturbance in the quiet corridor outside his office. A scuff on the floor, a shift in the air, and the lingering sense that someone had moved through the building unseen. Bush stood in the early morning quiet, studying the faint scuff on the polished floor. It was small, a half-moon arc in the waxed surface, but distinct enough to stand out among the perfectly maintained West Wing corridors. Staff moved with care. Custodians polished carefully. Marks like this didn't appear unless someone unfamiliar with the space passed through quickly. He crouched slightly, tracing the arc with 2 fingers. The wax felt disturbed, as if a shoe had pivoted sharply before changing direction. Bush looked toward the security camera mounted above. The overnight shift had already sent him the still frame, a blurry silhouette pushing through the entrance at 2:47 a.m. No badge scan, no audible entry alert, no exit log. A visitor who left only the shape of their presence, and now this scuff. He walked slowly down the hallway. The air carried a faint chill, sharper than usual. Climate control didn't fluctuate at this hour. Someone had opened a door nearby, letting the colder outer hallway air drift in. Bush followed the subtle draft toward the side passage that connected to a cluster of staff offices. Just inside the passage, he noticed a second clue, a thin line of displaced carpet fibers, faint but visible under the low lights. Someone had moved through here without knowing which areas absorbed sound and which ones amplified it. He paused at the junction where the corridor split. One path led toward the Roosevelt room, the other angled toward the lesser-used policy suite, a set of offices rarely visited before dawn. The disturbance pointed toward the suite. Bush straightened, letting the silence settle around him. Whoever the unlogged visitor was, their presence hadn't been accidental. Someone had come here with intent, and they had moved deeper into the West Wing than they should have. Bush followed the faint trail toward the policy suite, noticing how each step took him deeper into an area that rarely felt awake at this hour. The offices here were usually sealed for the night, lights off, doors locked, papers secured. Yet as he approached the first doorway, something subtle broke the pattern. The door was closed, but not fully latched. A thin sliver of darkness showed where it should have met the frame. He pressed the handle. It opened without sound. The room inside was untouched, at least at first glance. The desk sat immaculate, the blinds drawn, the lamp off. But one detail broke the stillness. The chair had been nudged a few inches off. Alignment, angled slightly toward the window rather than the desk. Not a natural position, not something an aide would leave overnight. Bush approached the chair and placed a hand on the armrest. Warm. Someone had been sitting here recently, long after the building should have been empty. He looked at the windowsill next. A faint smudge, shaped like the edge of a hand, streaked the dustless surface. It suggested someone had leaned forward, bracing themselves as they watched something outside or waited for movement in the hallway. Bush moved to the desk and checked the pen holder. All pens stood upright except one, which leaned slightly to the side as if it had been removed and replaced quickly. He opened the top drawer. Empty, too empty. Staffers rarely left drawers completely cleared, but whoever had sat here had either removed something or checked to make sure nothing was left for them. Bush closed the drawer softly. He stepped back into the hallway and paused. A subtle shift in air pressure passed through the corridor, coming from deeper within the suite, the kind caused when another door settles into place. Someone had been ahead of him, someone who knew exactly how to move without leaving a trace. But traces still existed. They always did. He followed the faint airflow toward the next office. Bush moved deeper into the policy suite, letting the subtle airflow guide him. The corridor narrowed slightly here, lined with framed memos and dated briefing schedules. None had been touched. None were askew. Yet the air carried that faint hint of movement, the residual displacement left behind when someone slips through quietly and recently. The second office door was fully closed, but the overhead light leaking faintly from beneath the frame betrayed something unusual. These lights were controlled manually and never left on overnight. Bush rested a hand on the door, feeling a slight warmth radiating from the metal. Proof someone had touched it not long ago. He opened it slowly. Inside, the office lights glowed softly, illuminating a desk that appeared almost painfully orderly. Files stacked perfectly. Stapler aligned exactly parallel to the blotter. Telephone handset resting neatly. And yet on the far corner of the desk, a single yellow sticky note sat half detached, its edge curling upward as if placed hurriedly. He approached. The note was blank, completely unused. No ink impressions, no stray graphite, but its position slightly crooked, contrasted sharply with the room's overall precision. He lifted it. The adhesive strip was warm. Bush looked toward the credenza. A thin line of dust along its surface had been disrupted. A smudged arc where a hand had rested or braced. Next to it, a binder lay angled out of alignment by a fraction of an inch. He slid it open. Empty. A binder prepared to hold content that never arrived or was removed. He closed it and surveyed the office again. One detail caught his eye. The chair behind the desk had been pushed in, but not fully. It sat just an inch farther back than usual, leaving a gap that suggested someone had stood abruptly. He stepped into the hallway, listened. A faint metallic click echoed somewhere deeper in the suite, soft, quick, and unmistakably a door latch settling. Someone was still ahead of him, still moving, still unseen, and Bush understood. This visitor hadn't wandered. They had followed a route only someone familiar with the building's quietest paths would know. Bush moved toward the sound of the settling latch, each step measured to keep his presence silent. The corridor led into a narrow connector hallway seldom used except by senior aides who needed to bypass busier routes. He paused at the threshold, studying the floor. A faint disruption in the carpet fibers stretched forward, a soft diagonal line left by someone shifting their weight before turning. He followed it. Halfway down the hall, he noticed a small cart pushed against the wall. Normally used to transport briefing binders, it held only a single object, an unused routing envelope, its flap unsealed. Bush picked it up. The paper felt warm, slightly creased at one corner, as though someone had held it for a moment before abandoning it. He set it down and continued deeper. The corridor eventually split toward a modest office used for private drafting, a place where aides prepared notes before they were formalized into official documents. As Bush approached, he saw the door standing ajar by an inch, a thin bar of light crossing the hallway floor. He eased it open. Inside, the drafting table lamp glowed softly. A single sheet of typing paper lay centered on the surface, blank, but bearing a faint indentation across its upper third. Bush ran his fingers lightly across it. The groove was shallow, consistent with handwriting pressed onto a page that had since been removed. A message had been written here, but not left here. Beside the sheet, a pencil rolled slightly as he touched the table. Its tip was dulled, its eraser worn down on one side, proof it had been used recently and quickly. On the other end of the table, the chair sat pushed back, angled as if someone had stood in a hurry. Bush lifted the blank page into the lamplight. The indentation wasn't legible, but it carried the rhythm of words. Short strokes, a pause, a long line, then another break. Whoever wrote the message had done so with certainty. He set the page down and scanned the room. Another detail emerged. The drafting room window was unlocked, its latch still warm. It led not outside, but into an interior courtyard walkway seldom traveled at night. Bush understood what that meant. The visitor hadn't merely passed through the suite. They had exited intentionally toward the courtyard, and they were staying just far enough ahead to remain unseen. Bush stepped into the courtyard walkway, the cool early morning air brushing against him as the drafting room window eased shut behind him. This narrow passage, enclosed by glass on one side and brick on the other, was seldom used but ideal for someone wanting to move quietly between wings. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone tiles, each sound swallowed quickly by the height of the surrounding walls. Near the midpoint of the walkway, something caught the corner of his eye, a faint smear on the glass, shaped like a partial palm print. Bush approached it. The oils were fresh enough to leave a visible sheen under the muted lights. Someone had paused here, leaning just long enough to gauge whether the path ahead was clear. He followed the walkway toward the small maintenance door at the far end. It was usually locked, but as he reached for the handle, he noticed the latch had not fully engaged. A slight push opened it with a soft creak. Behind it lay a short interior stairwell connecting to a discreet service corridor. Bush descended quietly. The corridor was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb. A maintenance cart stood parked against the wall, stocked neatly except for one drawer left open by a fraction. Inside the drawer, a box of gloves sat slightly shifted, as if a pair had been taken hastily. He moved past the cart and noticed a new clue, a small scrap of paper lying near the baseboard, torn with precision along one edge. He picked it up. Like the previous pieces, it was blank. No ink, no imprint, but the texture matched the drafting paper from the suite above, a breadcrumb trail made of absences. He rounded a corner toward a door marked storage access. Its keyhole glinted faintly, showing the kind of smudge left behind when a key is turned quickly. Bush tried the handle. It opened. Inside, the storage room was darker, stocked with shelves of unused office supplies, but one shelf had been left disturbed. A stack of notepads shifted slightly, one missing from the center of the pile. Bush lifted the remaining pads. Their weight told him nothing. Their arrangement told him everything. Someone had taken a pad, written a message, removed the page, erased the path, and moved on. He set the pads down and stepped back into the corridor. The air felt different now, not colder, not warmer, but lighter, as though the unseen visitor had just passed through moments ago, and the trail, faint as it was, led further still. Bush continued forward, following the subtle shifts that only someone familiar with the building's quieter mechanics would notice. The storage corridor narrowed into a T-junction, each branch dimly lit by low-wattage bulbs. At the corner, he paused. A faint, nearly invisible disturbance ran across the dustless floor, a narrow arc where a shoe had pivoted during a quick turn. He studied the arc closely. The pressure pattern suggested the visitor had turned right. Bush took that direction, stepping lightly. Ahead, the corridor opened into a seldom-used operations alcove. A long steel table sat in the center, typically reserved for overflow work during high-pressure days. Tonight it held one object, a closed binder with no label. Bush approached it, noting how it lay slightly off the table's center, like something placed down in a hurry rather than stored. He opened it, empty again. Page guides intact, interior clean, no residue of removed pages. But the upper corner of the binder's inside surface bore a faint imprint, the shallow outline of a sheet that had once rested against it. The weight and angle matched the indentation he'd seen earlier on the drafting table. The visitor had carried a message through multiple rooms, but never left the message itself. Bush set the binder down and scanned the alcove. On the far wall, a small command console used for internal routing lights displayed a single yellow indicator, not bright, but active enough to signal a recent transfer through the internal pneumatic line that serviced the west wing. He stepped closer. The console's surface was warm. Bush opened the cylinder hatch beneath it. The tube sat inside, still vibrating faintly from its journey. He removed the cylinder and twisted it open. Empty, not even a scrap, not even a corner. But the inside surface carried a thin streak of graphite, barely visible, the residue left when a pencil mark rubs against a smooth surface. Whoever the visitor was, they had placed something inside, then removed it during the route. Or someone else had. Bush placed the cylinder back and exhaled slowly. A pattern was emerging, not in what was present, but in the intentional gaps. Someone was signaling without leaving a message, someone who understood the building's blind spots and silent hours. This wasn't a trespass, it was a path meant for him to follow. Bush stepped away from the routing console and entered the narrow hallway beyond the operations alcove. This part of the West Wing ran close to the building's older infrastructure, where pipes hummed in the walls and the lighting dipped unpredictably. Few staff ventured here, unless absolutely necessary. A few paces in, something subtle caught his attention, a faint shift in the dust along the baseboard, forming a broken line leading toward a maintenance access door at the end of the hall. Bush followed the line. The door's handle bore a faint, oily sheen, A partial palm print, smudged diagonally, the same angle he'd noticed earlier in the courtyard walkway. He opened the door. Inside, the maintenance corridor stretched long and quiet, cut by harsh overhead lights that left alternating stripes of brightness and shadow. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old wiring. He walked forward, scanning the floor for clues. Near a junction box, a glove lay folded on itself, discarded but clean. Bush lifted it. The fabric was warm, not worn, but held recently. He continued until he reached a small utility room at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar. Bush nudged it open. The room inside held only the essentials: fuse panels, mop buckets, and the narrow shelf where maintenance logs were kept. Yet something small sat alone on the shelf, a red grease pencil, capped, its edge flattened slightly, as though pressed into a pocket against a hard surface. He turned it in his hand. The tip was dulled, recently used, but nothing in this room bore markings. No signs, no notes, no diagrams. The pencil was out of place. Bush placed it down and examined the maintenance log next to it. The top page bore no writing, but the next page showed a faint pressure line, a curve, a brief stroke, like someone had tested the pencil on the paper before tearing off a page. Another message written and removed. He stepped back into the hall. Then he heard it, a soft, muted sound from the far end of the corridor. Not footsteps, not machinery. A door settling into a frame, gently, as if someone had just slipped through with deliberate care. Bush turned his head toward the noise. The unseen visitor was still ahead of him, moving deeper into the West Wing's hidden arteries, always just out of sight, always one door away, and the trail of silences continued. Bush followed the fading echo toward the end of the maintenance corridor, where a heavy service door connected to a small vestibule, used by only a handful of staff. The door, always slow to close, now rested fully shut, too gently to have slammed, too quickly to have settled without intention. Someone had eased it into place. He pressed the release bar and stepped inside. The vestibule was dim, lit by a single emergency bulb casting a pale cone of light across the floor. At the center of that cone lay a subtle clue, a single speck of black residue, no larger than a grain of sand, resting against the tile's grout line. Bush crouched. He rubbed the speck between his fingers. Graphite, the same as the faint streak inside the pneumatic cylinder, and the same as the drafting impressions he'd seen earlier. The visitor had handled a pencil repeatedly, writing, erasing, folding, removing, yet never leaving the message itself behind. Only the tools, the pressure marks, the motions. He stood and examined the vestibule. 3 doors led out, one to a secured stairwell, one to an equipment lift, and one to a narrow hallway that wrapped around the perimeter of the West Wing's lower floor. Bush approached the perimeter hallway door first. The push plate bore a faint warmth under his palm. He opened it. The hallway was long, with no alcoves, no nooks, a place where sound traveled cleanly, yet it was silent now. As he walked, he noticed the slightest irregularity in the acoustic panels lining the walls. One panel sat misaligned, just enough to create a small shadow at its edge. Bush touched it. The panel shifted, unlocking with a soft click. Behind it lay a small recessed cubby, an outdated communications niche long since abandoned. Inside, on the metal shelf, sat a single folded sheet of paper. Bush froze. This fold was different. Smaller, tighter, more deliberate. He reached for it carefully and unfolded it under the narrow hallway light. Blank. But the paper's texture was different from the scraps he'd found earlier. Firmer stock, slightly thicker, the kind used for internal clearances and confidential route. It bore a faint indent, as though pressed against another page that had carried real writing. He ran his thumb along the crease. The visitor hadn't left a message. They had left the echo of one, a final empty marker along a path made of absence. Somewhere behind that echo lay the purpose of this unseen movement. Bush folded the sheet again and slipped it into his pocket. The corridor ahead remained silent, waiting. Bush stood alone in the narrow perimeter hallway, the folded sheet resting between his fingers. Every step he had taken through the West Wing's quiet arteries, every warm doorknob, shifted chair, erased page, and faint imprint had led him to this final empty fold. Not a message, but the outline of one. Not communication, but intention. He leaned slightly against the wall, listening to the low mechanical thrum rising through the building as the first signs of morning stirred. Soon offices would light up, doors would open, and the silent paths he'd traced would vanish beneath routine and footsteps. Whatever had happened tonight existed only in the thin margins where the building slept. Bush refolded the page, feeling its crisp resistance. The visitor had stayed just beyond reach, leaving only the quiet contour of their movement, guiding him through a trail built from what wasn't there. He slipped the fold into his pocket. As he turned back toward the main corridor, he understood that this wasn't a breach or a warning. It was something far subtler, a signal left by someone who knew exactly when to appear and precisely how to disappear. Some visitors leave no trace, but their absence speaks louder than their presence. Bush walked on as dawn crept across the west wing.